Welcome to a new science fiction story, friends. In this episode, we'll hear the story of Theodore and the alien woman Nova. Buckle up, Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. They gave him the ugliest alien woman just to make fun of him. But now everyone is talking about their love. Erebos had 2 moons, 3 seasons of winter, and exactly 0 reasons to exist, which made it the perfect place to send men the colonial service wanted to forget. Theodore had arrived 8 months earlier with a duffel bag, a maintenance certification, and the naive assumption that a frozen rock at the edge of settled space might at least be quiet. It was not quiet. It was, in fact, the loudest place he had ever lived, because when there is nothing to do and nowhere to go and the temperature outside is described in the official handbook as survivable in short bursts, people fill the void with the only entertainment available to them, which is cruelty. And on the morning they summoned him to the assignment hall, Theodore already knew he was the entertainment. He knew because Sergeant Hudson had grinned at him in the mess that morning, and Hudson only grinned when something unpleasant was about to happen to someone who wasn't Hudson. He knew because the corridor to the assignment hall was fuller than usual, men leaning against the frost-sweating walls with the loose, expectant posture of an audience. He knew because Erebos never gathered a crowd for anything that wasn't a fight, an execution, or a joke, and Theodore had a reasonable suspicion which of the 3 he was. The assignment hall was really just a decommissioned cargo bay with a heater that worked one wall at a time, so half the room glowed orange, and the other half breathed fog. At the front stood Lieutenant Carter, a man whose entire personality was the particular shine of his boots, and beside him, in a line, stood the Vexcari. Theodore had seen Vexcari before, in briefings and once in person, and the thing that always struck him was how unremarkably human they were. If you passed one in a corridor and kept your eyes at shoulder height, you'd never know. The only tell was the ears, long, tapering, elegant things that swept back and up like something out of the old fairy stories his grandmother used to read. The kind with elves in enchanted forests rather than aliens on dying colonies. That was the whole difference. A pair of ears. Empires had been built and traded and broken over less. "Officer Theodore," Carter said, and Theodore watched the crowd lean in, because the sergeant said his name the way you say the name of a man about to slip on ice, with relish. The service, in its generosity, has authorized companion assignments for select personnel, to reward, dedication. A ripple of laughter, because everyone in the room knew Theodore had been assigned here as punishment for reporting a supply officer who'd been selling colony rations, and dedication was the word they'd all agreed to use instead. "We saved a special one for you." They brought her out from behind the line. Later, Theodore would try to remember the exact order in which the room laughed, because it seemed to come in waves, each man discovering the joke a half-second after the man beside him. First, they saw her skin, which was pale. Not the healthy pale of someone kept indoors, but a deep, luminous bone white that looked, in the orange half of the room, almost blue. Then they saw the scars, thin silvered lines that mapped one cheek and vanished under her collar. Then, and this was where the laughter crested, they saw the ear. The right one whole and beautiful and swept back like the others, and the left one broken, the elegant tapering point snapped off ragged a third of the way up, so that it ended blunt and wrong, a sentence cut off mid-word, and she was looking at the floor. That was the part that stayed with him. She stood there while 40 men laughed at her, and she looked at the floor as if she had expected nothing else, as if this were simply the weather. "Her name's Nova," Carter said, wiping his eye. "Previous owners returned her. Apparently even they had standards." The crowd loved that one. Hudson was actually holding his stomach. "Sign here, officer, and try not to lose your appetite." Theodore looked at the data sheet. He looked at Nova, who did not look back. And here was the thing about Theodore. The thing that 31 years of being small and overlooked and shoved to the edges of every room had taught him at considerable expense. Bullies are not paid in what they do to you. They are paid in the reaction. That's the entire economy. Take away the reaction, and you take away the coin, and they are left standing there having spent a great deal of effort for nothing, which is the closest thing to justice a man like Theodore was ever likely to arrange. So he did not flinch. He did not protest, which would have been a reaction, or laugh along, which would have been worse. He picked up the stylus, signed his name in the neat, unhurried hand his grandmother had beaten into him, and set it down. "Thank you, Lieutenant," he said, with a warmth so genuine and so absolutely lethal that the nearest few men stopped laughing without quite knowing why. "This is the nicest thing anyone's done for me on this planet," which, granted, is a low bar, but still. He turned to Nova and offered his arm, the way you might for a lady stepping down from a carriage in one of those forest stories, and when she flinched at the movement, he simply held it there, steady, unhurried, a bridge she could cross or not. "It's cold out," he told her. "Colder than in here, if you can believe it. Stay close and mind the ice by the airlock. It's put 3 men in the infirmary this week, and I refuse to be number 4. She didn't take his arm, but she followed, half a step behind, and the crowd parted for them in a silence that had begun, very faintly, to curdle, because a joke needs a victim who knows he's been made one, and Theodore was walking out with his chin up as though he'd won something. Hudson called one last remark after them about the ears, something clever he'd clearly been saving. Theodore didn't turn around. He just lifted one hand over his shoulder in a cheerful little wave, and kept walking, out through the groaning airlock and into the murderous cold, where the twin moons hung low and enormous over a world of ice, and the woman nobody wanted walked beside the man nobody remembered, both of them exhaling silver into the dark. Theodore's quarters had been designed by someone who believed that human beings, like ration paste, could be compressed for easier storage. It was a single room barely wide enough to turn around in without introducing your elbow to the wall, containing one bunk, one fold-down table, one chair that had been repaired so many times it was now more solder than chair, and a window the size of a dinner plate that looked out onto the ice fields and let in a persistent, aggrieved draft. He had spent 8 months making it habitable through the sheer force of not having anywhere better to be. When he opened the door and stepped aside to let Nova enter first, he saw her take it all in, the cramped little world of it, the single bunk especially, and he watched her shoulders draw up toward her ears in a way he was beginning to understand meant she was bracing for something. "So," he said, closing the door against the cold, "here's the grand tour. That's the bed. It's yours. Before you argue, and you're not arguing, but before you do, I want you to know I've slept in worse. I've slept in a supply crate that still smelled of the previous tenant, who was, I believe, a large quantity of pickled fish. The floor here is an upgrade with a 5-star rating." He unrolled his spare thermal mat along the narrow strip of floor with a flourish, as if presenting a suite. "See? Luxurious. I may never use the bunk again out of pure principle." She said nothing. She stood by the wall with her hands folded and her eyes down and waited. And it took Theodore a moment to grasp what she was waiting for. And when he did grasp it, something cold and unpleasant turned over in his stomach that had nothing to do with the draft. She was waiting to be told what she was for. He decided in that moment that he was simply never going to address the thing she was braced for. Not that night, and not any night, and that he'd rather sleep on the floor until the heat death of the universe than watch her flinch like that again. So instead, he busied himself with the heat core, a squat cylindrical unit in the corner that was supposed to keep the room at a survivable temperature, and instead maintained a temperature best described as opinionated. "Now this," he announced, thumping it fondly, "is Gerald. Gerald and I have an understanding. I don't ask him to do his job, and he doesn't do it. It's the healthiest relationship I've had in years." The core sputtered, coughed out a wash of lukewarm air, and subsided into a resentful hum. "See? Emotionally distant. We're perfect for each other." The corner of Nova's mouth did something. It was not a smile. It was the distant relative of a smile, the ghost of one seen through frosted glass. But Theodore caught it, and he had the good sense not to point at it and shout, which is the surest way to kill such a thing. He just kept talking. He talked while he heated 2 pouches of ration paste, narrating its contents with the grim enthusiasm of a nature documentarian. The label claims savory protein medley, but I have personally identified notes of drywall, regret, and a faint whisper of the sea, by which I mean salt, by which I mean despair. And he set one pouch on the table near her and retreated to the far end of the room to eat his own, giving her space, not watching, so that when he finally heard the small sound of her eating too, it came as a quiet relief he didn't comment on. That was the shape their first days took. Theodore learned her the way you learn a shy animal or a difficult machine, by observation and patience and refusing to make sudden movements. He learned that she flinched at slammed doors and raised voices, so he moved through the room like a man in a library and greeted the morning shift change through the wall with an obscene gesture rather than the shouted insult it deserved. He learned that she waited to be told before she ate, so he simply started leaving food where she could reach it and turning away, until one morning she took it without waiting, and he had to look very hard at the window to keep his face from betraying how much that meant. He learned that at night, when the twin moons rose and poured their doubled light through the little frost-glazed window, her white skin caught it and turned to something silver and unreal, and that she would sit and watch that light for hours, and that this was the one time she looked not braced but simply, quietly, somewhere else. He never asked her to speak. He filled the silence himself, cheerfully and without expectation, until the silence stopped feeling like an absence and started feeling like a room they both lived in. And then, on the 9th night, Gerald died. Not the usual sputtering half-death, but a genuine, final, dramatic collapse, the core going dark and cold with a sound like a sigh, and the temperature in the little room beginning immediately and honestly to drop. Theodore swore, dug out his tools, and spent 40 minutes performing increasingly desperate surgery on the thing, while the frost crept in from the walls, and he had just reached the stage of bargaining with it out loud. "Gerald, buddy, we had a deal. This is very unlike you." When a pale hand appeared beside his in the dim light, and with 2 fingers, gently moved his own hand aside. He went still. Nova crouched over the open core. She didn't look at him. She looked at the machine, and her expression while she looked at it was one Theodore had never seen on her before, focused and unafraid and entirely present, and her scarred hands moved through the tangle of components with a fluency that stopped his breath, reseating a coupling here, bridging a dead relay there, coaxing something loose back into place with a confidence that no colony maintenance manual had ever taught anyone. The core shuddered. Then it caught, and warmth rolled out into the room. Real warmth, steadier than Gerald had produced in the whole 8 months of their acquaintance. She sat back on her heels and, for one unguarded second, looked almost pleased. Then she remembered herself, and the shutters came down, and she folded her hands and lowered her eyes and waited once again to see whether she'd done something wrong. Theodore looked at the humming core. He looked at her hands, which knew things. He wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long time, to ask her 100 questions. Instead, he said very casually, still looking at the machine so she wouldn't have to meet his eyes, "Well, Gerald likes you better than me. Can't say I blame him." And he stretched out on his thermal mat as though nothing remarkable had happened at all, and after a long moment he heard her settle onto the bunk, and the 2 of them lay in the warm dark she had made, and neither of them said a single word, and it was, Theodore thought, the best conversation he'd had on Erebos yet. Word of Gerald's resurrection got around, because on Erebos a working heat core was gossip on the level of a royal scandal, and within a week 3 separate men had shown up at Theodore's door with dead cores of their own and expressions of studied casualness, asking if maybe his companion could take a look, since she clearly had, a knack. Theodore turned every one of them away with the same cheerful, immovable politeness he'd used on Carter. "She's not a repair service," he told them, "and even if she were, you'd have to book an appointment, and she's fully occupied through the next geological epoch." What he did not say, because it was none of their business, was that he'd caught the way Nova had gone rigid the first time a stranger appeared in the doorway looking at her hands like a resource to be requisitioned, and that he had decided he would freeze solid before he let her become the colony's convenient tool, the way she'd clearly been something's convenient tool before. That decision cost him. It always did. Refusing to lend her out marked him, in the colony's arithmetic, as a man hoarding something valuable, and men who hoard become targets. Hudson took to calling him the horn collector in the mess, a joke Theodore didn't understand until he did, and the understanding put him in a foul enough mood that he came very close to spending his few remaining social credits on breaking Hudson's nose. He didn't. He simply carried his tray to the far table and ate alone, as he had for 8 months, except that now the loneliness had a strange new texture to it, because it wasn't really loneliness anymore. There was someone in his room. There was someone who watched the moons. It was the moons, in the end, that got her talking. They were sitting in the doubled silver light one night, Theodore on his mat and Nova on the bunk, and he was doing what he always did, narrating idle nonsense into the quiet, some theory about which of the two moons was the responsible older sibling and which was the one who never called their mother. When Nova said quietly, without looking away from the window, "The larger one is called Ithlin. It means the one who stayed." Her voice was low and a little rough from disuse, and Theodore froze so completely that he nearly cricked his neck, because in 3 weeks she had not said a full sentence, and now here was one, unfolding in the dark like something rare and easily startled. He kept absolutely still. He did not turn to look at her. He understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life on the outside of every room, that if he made this into an event, she would never do it again. "Ithlin," he repeated as casually as if she told him things every night. "Good name. Bit judgmental, though, if you're the moon that left." And she made a sound. It was small and involuntary and quickly stifled, but it was unmistakably a laugh, the first he had ever heard from her, and it landed in Theodore's chest with a force entirely out of proportion to its size. After that, the words came in slow, uneven trickles, never forced, offered like the ration paste, left where he could reach them and not remarked upon. He learned over nights the shape of what had been done to her. She had been Vexcari, was Vexcari, he corrected himself, though she used the past tense about herself the way one speaks of the dead. She had worked on the great thermal engines that kept her own people's ice world alive, and there had been a failure, a cascade in the deep cores that killed people, and she had seen it coming and had said so loudly to men who preferred not to hear it from her. When it happened exactly as she'd warned, they did not thank her. They needed the disaster to have a cause that wasn't their own negligence, and a woman who'd predicted it made a convenient one. Sabotage, they called it. Her scars were from that time. Her ear, she touched the broken point without seeming to notice she was doing it, was from the day they cast her out, marking her as fault-bearing so that any Vexcari who saw her would know, and then they'd traded her off-world like spoiled goods, glad to be rid of the proof of what they'd done. "They gave you to the humans as a punishment," Theodore said slowly, "and the humans gave you to me as a punishment. You've been passed down a whole chain of punishments, and somehow you're the only one in it who did nothing wrong." Nova looked at him then. Actually looked full on, her downcast eyes lifting to meet his and staying there, and in the doubled moonlight, her white face with its silver scars was not the ruin the assignment hall had laughed at, but something else entirely, something that made the word beautiful rise up in Theodore's mind, unbidden, and refused to leave. Neither of them looked away. The moment stretched past the point where a glance is only a glance and became the other thing, the held thing, and his hand was resting on the edge of the bunk near hers, and she did not move hers away, and he did not move his, and the not moving was louder than any words either of them had ever managed. It might have gone somewhere, that silence. But the wall speaker crackled to life with the flat, automated tone of a colony-wide advisory, and they both startled back into themselves. "Attention all personnel," it droned. "Thermal grid efficiency has fallen below optimal parameters. Conserve auxiliary heat. This is routine." A pause, then, as if grudgingly appended, "Storm season projections have been revised. Details to follow." Theodore frowned at the speaker. "That's the third routine advisory this week." Nova had gone very still, but not with fear this time. She was listening to the low, grinding hum that lived under the floor of the whole colony, the sound of the central grid that everyone had long since stopped hearing, and her head was tilted, and her one whole ear and one broken ear were both angled toward it, and her expression was the focused, unafraid one she'd worn over Gerald's open guts. "That grinding," she said quietly. "How long has it made that sound?" "The grid? Always. It's just old." "No." She shook her head slowly, and for the first time since he'd met her, Theodore heard something in her voice that frightened him, precisely because it was so calm. "That is not the sound of old. That is the sound of a core beginning to fail. I have heard it before." She looked at the floor as if she could see straight through it to the dying machine beneath. "The last time I heard it, people did not listen to me either. The thing about a colony freezing to death is that it does not happen all at once, which is somehow worse. It happens the way falling asleep in the snow happens, gradually and then comfortably and then not at all. And the men of Erebos met the beginning of it with the same magnificent stupidity that men have brought to every disaster since the invention of the disaster. The grid gave out 4 days after Nova heard it dying, and it gave out during the storm season's first real teeth, and the wall speakers spent the whole morning insisting it was routine while the temperature in the corridors dropped low enough that the frost on the walls stopped melting and simply began to grow. Theodore had tried in those 4 days to warn someone. He had gone to Carter with what Nova had told him, and Carter had looked at him with the profound weariness of a man being addressed by a subordinate and said, "Officer, are you now a thermal engineer, or is it your alien?" And the way he said your alien had made Theodore's hands curl, and nothing had come of it except a fresh round of horn collector jokes. So when the grid finally failed and the emergency klaxons began their idiot shrieking, Theodore felt no vindication at all, only a cold, flat dread, because being right about a catastrophe buys you exactly nothing while the catastrophe is busy happening to you. The command center was chaos. He shouldered his way in because in a crisis nobody checks credentials, and found Carter and Hudson and a dozen others crowded around a status board that was entirely, cheerfully red, shouting contradictory orders at technicians who had clearly never been trained for this because no one had believed it could occur. The central heat core, a thing the size of a small building, buried deep beneath the colony, had suffered exactly the cascade Nova had described, and the men in charge of it were discovering in real time that they did not know how it worked, only how to turn it on, which is a different and much less useful category of knowledge. "Vent the auxiliary!" someone was yelling. "That'll only feed the cascade," someone else yelled back incorrectly, and Theodore watched the whole apparatus of colonial authority reveal itself for what it had always been, which was a group of frightened men who had gotten very good at looking certain. He did not decide to bring Nova. She was simply there, at his shoulder, because she had followed him from their quarters the way he'd once offered her his arm, half a step behind and unasked. And now she stepped past him into the red-lit room and looked at the status board, and her whole body changed. The braced stillness fell off her like a dropped coat. What stood there instead was something Theodore had glimpsed over Gerald and over the failing grid advisory, but had never seen at full height. An engineer, reading a dying machine, entirely unafraid. "You have perhaps 90 minutes, she said. Her rough, quiet voice did not carry, and yet somehow the room heard it and turned, and the sight of her, the white skin, the scars, the broken ear, produced a ripple of the old reflexive contempt that even now, even freezing, these men could not put down. Hudson actually laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Oh, brilliant. The horn's got opinions." 90 minutes, Nova said again, unbothered, until the cascade reaches the coolant manifold, at which point the core does not simply stop. It ruptures. Everything within 2 kilometers of it becomes part of the ice. She let that sit. "I have shut down a cascading Vexcari core while it was doing this exact thing. I am the only person on this planet who has ever done so. You may laugh, or you may live. I find people rarely have time for both." There was a silence in the red light. Carter looked at her, and looked at the cheerfully catastrophic board, and Theodore watched the man perform the fastest moral recalculation of his career, arriving with visible pain at the conclusion that his dignity was worth less than his life. "What do you need?" he said, and did not say your alien. What she needed was Theodore, mostly, and a maintenance crawlway, and roughly 40 minutes of the worst work either of them had ever done. The route to the core's manual override ran through service tunnels never meant for human occupancy in a live crisis, and it was there, wedged in a frozen crawl space with the machine screaming its death around them, that Theodore got to watch Nova do the thing she had been made for and then punished for. She talked him through it, her voice the calmest thing in that howling dark, directing his hands to the couplings she couldn't reach while she worked the ones she could. Isolate this relay, bridge that manifold, no. The blue coupling. Theodore, unless you have grown fond of the blue coupling and wish to be buried with it. Even here. Even now. He laughed, wedged in the ice with his life measured in minutes, because she had made a joke, and the sound of his laugh in that terrible place seemed to steady them both. The core fought her. Twice it surged, and the temperature readout spiked, and Theodore was certain they'd lost, and twice her scarred hands moved faster than he could follow and pulled it back from the edge. And the second time she did it, she was breathing hard, and her broken ear was rimed white with frost, and the emergency lighting caught her from below so that she looked for one absurd holy instant, like something out of an altarpiece, a saint mid-miracle. Then, with a final coaxing pressure on a valve she'd been nursing like a wounded thing, the terrible grinding under the whole colony changed pitch, lowered, eased, and settled into the resentful, healthy, uncatastrophic hum of a machine that had decided, on reflection, not to kill everyone after all. The silence after was enormous. They made their slow, frozen way back to the command center, and when they stepped into the red light that was already fading to ordinary white, as the board cycled from crisis to merely dire, the men who had laughed at her stood and looked at her, and did not laugh. Some of them, Theodore saw, could not quite meet her eyes. The same downcast look she used to wear, transferred now onto them like a debt. Hudson opened his mouth, found nothing in it, and closed it again. Later, in their own quarters, in the warmth she had preserved for the whole colony without any of them ever having done a single thing to deserve it, Theodore and Nova sat in the doubled moonlight, and neither of them spoke, because they were far too tired, and because some things are said better in the not speaking. His hand was resting on the bunk near hers again, the way it had been the night the advisory interrupted them. This time nothing interrupted them. This time her hand moved the small distance across the cold blanket and came to rest over his and stayed, and Theodore turned his palm up to hold it, and that was all. And it was everything. And outside the little frost-glazed window, the two moons watched the one who had stayed finally, quietly, beheld. For 11 days, Erebos was almost a decent place to live. Nova had saved everyone on it, and the everyone in question responded with the shy, fumbling gratitude of people who had spent weeks being cruel, and now didn't know where to put their hands. Men who had laughed at her in the assignment hall began nodding to her in the corridors, awkwardly, as though greeting a superior officer they weren't sure outranked them. Someone left a heated blanket outside Theodore's door with no note. Someone else, more ambitiously, left a jar of real coffee, which on Erebos was worth roughly its weight in blood. Nova received all of it with a wary bafflement that Theodore found unbearably endearing, and which he narrated relentlessly. That's called respect. It's an acquired taste, bit like the coffee. Until she threatened, deadpan, to reroute the heat core to his side of the room specifically, and he understood that she was joking, and that her jokes now came easily, and that this was the single greatest achievement of his life. He should have known it wouldn't last. On Erebos, the good things never had the courtesy to. The Vexcari ship came down out of the storm on the 12th day, and it did not ask permission. It was a long, pale vessel, elegant in the way Nova was elegant, all swept lines and quiet menace, and it settled onto the ice outside the colony's main dome like a verdict. Theodore was in the command center when the proximity alarms went, and he watched Carter go gray, and he understood before anyone said a word that this had come for her. The Vexcari who disembarked were 3, and they were tall and pale and whole-eared, and dressed in the muted silver of some authority, and the one who spoke, a woman with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed by continents, introduced herself only as an envoy of the Reclamation Council, which Theodore thought was a magnificently ugly phrase for what it meant. "We have come," she said, in the flat, perfect standard the Vexcari always spoke, for the property designated Nova. Her disposal off-world was provisional. Circumstances have changed. Circumstances. It took Theodore a moment, and then it landed with a sick lurch. They'd heard. Somehow, across the cold gulf of space, word had reached her people that the disgraced woman they'd thrown away had just single-handedly shut down a cascading core in front of an entire human colony. And now she was not spoiled goods anymore. Now she was a proven asset. Now they wanted her back, not to clear her name, not to say they'd been wrong, but to fold her competence back into the machine that had discarded it and pretend the discarding had never happened. "She's not property," Theodore said, before he'd decided to speak, and every head in the command center turned to him, and the envoy regarded him the way one regards a small dog that has learned to bark a whole word. "She was surrendered under our law," the envoy said. "She was marked. She was traded. By every measure that binds a Vexcari, she belongs to the council that cast her out." She said it without cruelty, which was worse than cruelty, because it meant she believed it, the way you believe arithmetic. And here was the moment Theodore had been dreading since the ship came down, because he could feel the shape of the colony's decision forming in the frightened silence. These men owed Nova their lives, but they also owed the Vexcari a treaty and trade rights and the continued fiction that Erebos mattered to anyone, and Theodore knew the arithmetic of men in charge, knew it in his bones, knew they would weigh one disgraced woman against all of that and find her light. Carter's mouth was already opening to be reasonable. Theodore had heard reasonable men give people away his whole life. "Wait," he said. He didn't have a plan. He had, in fact, nothing at all except the certainty that had carried him out of the assignment hall with his chin up, the old hard-won knowledge that the entire economy of cruelty runs on the victim agreeing to be one. And he turned, not to the envoy and not to Carter, but to Nova, who had come to stand in the doorway of the command center with her hands folded and her eyes down, braced, once again, to be handed to whoever wanted her. And Theodore looked at her and did the only thing he had ever known how to do for her, which was to refuse to make the choice on her behalf. "They keep saying you belong to them," he said quietly, just to her, as if the whole freezing room weren't hanging on it. "And everybody in here is about to have a very long, very boring argument about who you belong to, like you're a heat core with good reviews. But I've noticed something in all these weeks. Nobody's ever once asked what you want. Not them, not the humans, not the last lot, or the lot before that." He held her gaze and let the silence be an offering, the way she'd taught him silence could be. "So I'm asking, out loud, in front of everyone so they all have to hear it, what do you want, Nova?" For a long moment she said nothing, and Theodore's heart went somewhere terrible, because he thought perhaps he had asked too much, thought perhaps a lifetime of being an object had worn the wanting out of her entirely. Then she lifted her head. And she looked at the envoy with the same fearless focus she turned on dying machines. And when she spoke, her rough, quiet voice filled the room the way it had filled the command center on the day of the cascade, needing no volume because the truth it carried was heavy enough to carry itself. "You marked me a saboteur," she said, "to hide that your council ignored my warning. I did not fail the core. I predicted its failure, and you needed a criminal more than you needed to be correct." Her hand rose to the broken point of her ear, and for once she did not touch it in shame, but showed it, deliberately, to the woman who had come for her. "You broke this so that everyone would know I was at fault. And now that my fault has proven useful, you would have it back, and me with it, and you would never once say the word you owe me." She lowered her hand. "You want the engineer without ever admitting you exiled her for being right. And the answer, envoy, is no." The command center did not breathe, and Theodore, standing beside her, felt the whole long chain of punishments she'd been passed down finally, in that frozen room, snap. The envoy was not accustomed to the word no, and it showed. She stood very still in the command center's white light, recalculating, and Theodore watched her arrive at the same place Carter had arrived at the day of the cascade. The discovery that certainty is not the same thing as power, and that she had rather less of the latter than she'd walked in with. Because Nova had said the one thing the council could not survive being said out loud in front of witnesses, that their crime had a shape, and that the shape had a name. and that the very competence they'd come to repossess was the proof of their lie. Every word of it was now standing in a room full of humans who owed that competence their lives. "You have no authority to refuse," the envoy tried, but the flat perfection of her voice had developed a hairline crack. "She has mine," Carter said. Theodore turned so fast he nearly fell over. Carter looked as surprised as anyone to hear it come out of his own mouth, but having said it, he seemed to decide, with the grim resolve of a man committing to a bad dive, to keep going. "This colony operates under human colonial charter. Any individual who performs a life-preserving act for the colony may petition for protected residency. It's an old law, mostly used for defecting technicians, but it's a law." He met the envoy's eyes. "She shut down your cascade with her hands in the ice while my people stood around and read the manual upside down. She's petitioned. I've granted it. She's under charter protection, and if your council wants to make an interstellar incident out of dragging a protected resident off a human world, I'd invite you to explain to your superiors why you thought a woman you'd already thrown away was worth a war." He paused. "Also, and I want to be clear about this, she's the only person on this rock who knows how to keep the grid running, so even if I didn't have a law, I'd have arithmetic. And I've found arithmetic tends to win." It was, Theodore thought, the first genuinely decent thing he had ever seen Carter do, and it had taken the man being personally nearly frozen to death to manage it, which was about the going rate for decency on Erebos. The envoy left with her whole ears and her wounded dignity, and the pale, elegant ship lifted off the ice and vanished back into the storm, and it did not come again. Theodore learned, much later, that a formal record of the Council's exile of Nova, her own words, transmitted from the command center's logs into the human colonial registry, had made its quiet way through the correct channels, and that a woman marked a saboteur to cover a council's negligence was now, in the eyes of at least one small human bureaucracy, on the record as the engineer who had been right. It would not undo what they'd done to her, but it meant that somewhere, in a file, the truth existed, and Nova had put it there herself, and that was a different thing than being cleared by someone else's mercy. She had cleared herself. They rebuilt the grid over the following months, and they rebuilt it to Nova's design, which meant it worked, which was a novel and disorienting experience for everyone involved. She trained a crew, actual technicians now, men who had once left coffee outside a door and now took notes when she spoke, and who had learned, mostly, to stop calling the couplings by the wrong colors. Hudson turned out to be, against all expectation, a fast study. He never quite apologized to her, because men like Hudson would sooner eat the ice than apologize, but he did once, wordlessly, take the worst crawlway shift so she wouldn't have to. And Theodore decided that on Erebos, this counted as a poem. The dead planet did not become alive, but it became a place with a future measured in something longer than the next storm, and that, for Erebos, was practically a spring. And the two of them walked its corridors, and the officers who had once laughed fell silent when they passed. Not the curdled, uneasy silence of the assignment hall, but a different quiet, the kind that settles over people when they are looking at something they don't have the words for and have finally stopped pretending they do. They saw a man and a woman walking close, saying nothing, needing nothing said. They saw her scarred, white face and her broken ear catch the corridor light, and somewhere in the weeks of watching her save them and rebuild their world and refuse, at last, to be anyone's punishment, the scars and the ear had stopped being the joke and become simply her, and her had become, without any of them quite noticing the moment it happened, the most beautiful thing on the whole frozen rock. No one dared ask Theodore what he saw in her. They had worked out, too late to take any credit for it, that he'd simply seen it first. As for Theodore, the small, overlooked man who had spent 31 years surviving by refusing to give bullies the reaction they'd paid for, he found, in the end, that he had learned to do more than refuse. Refusing had kept him alive, but it had also kept him alone, a man defined entirely by the things he would not give the world. Nova had taught him the harder thing, which was what to give when it was safe to. He had learned it slowly, the way he'd learned her, by leaving something where it could be reached and turning away, by filling a silence until it became a home, by asking, out loud, in front of everyone, what someone wanted, and then honoring the answer. He was still overlooked by most of the colony. He found he no longer minded. Being seen by everyone had never once made him happy. Being seen by one person, completely, turned out to be the whole of it. On the night the new grid came fully online, they sat in their cramped quarters, which they had not troubled to leave for larger ones, because the room was small and warm and theirs, and Gerald still lived in the corner making his opinionated noises like a resentful old relative who refused to die. The twin moons rose and poured their doubled silver through the little frost-glazed window, and Nova watched them the way she always had. But she was not somewhere else anymore. She was here. Her hand was in his, unhesitating now, worn familiar by 100 nights. "Ithlin," Theodore said quietly, nodding at the larger moon. "The one who stayed." "Yes," Nova said. She turned from the window, and she looked at him with her eyes lifted and unafraid and entirely present. The downcast girl from the assignment hall gone so completely he could barely remember her. "The one who stayed," she said again, and she was not talking about the moon, and they both knew it, and she smiled. A real one now, no ghost about it, warm and whole and hers, and outside the window, the light of the two moons lay silver across a world of ice that was, against every expectation the universe had ever held for it, and for the two people warm within it, no longer quite so dead. They gave him the one nobody wanted, and they laughed, because they were certain they knew what beauty was, and certain she wasn't it. But beauty was never the thing they thought it was. It was never the whole ear or the unmarked skin. It was someone bothering to look, really look, at what everyone else had already decided to throw away. Theodore didn't save Nova. He did something rarer. He refused to agree that she was worthless, and then he waited, quietly, in the cold, until she could see it too. So here is what the story leaves in your hands. Somewhere in your life there is a person the room has already laughed at, already filed away, already decided is the punchline. And somewhere, maybe, that person is you. Ask yourself honestly, how many people have you passed over because someone else laughed first? How many times have you looked at a scar instead of the person wearing it? And the harder question, the one that stays after the screen goes dark, if the whole world had decided you were the joke, who would be willing to sit in the cold beside you long enough to learn that you were never the joke at all? Because the officers all thought the cruelest thing was being handed someone unwanted. They were wrong. The cruelest thing is to be unwanted and to have no one who ever bothers to look twice. Be the one who looks twice. It costs you almost nothing. And to someone out there in the cold, it might quietly be everything. The end. Friends, we've reached the end of Nova and Theodore's story. I hope you enjoyed it. In return for our efforts, please hit the like button, leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. The next science fiction story is coming very soon. Until then, take care.